The moving truck pulled away from my driveway for the last time, leaving behind 60 years of memories and the echo of my son's final words ringing in my ears. "Find somewhere else to live, Mom. This house should have been mine years ago." What Marcus didn't know was that I had already found somewhere else. What he also didn't know was that the house he'd been counting on inheriting had just been sold to strangers, and every penny was going somewhere he'd never see it again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Catherine Walsh, and at 71 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of betrayal life could offer. I was wrong. The cruelest blow came from the person I'd sacrificed everything for, the baby I'd rocked through countless sleepless nights, the child I'd worked 3 jobs to put through college, the man who now stood in my living room demanding I pack my belongings and leave the only home I'd ever known. It started 3 months ago when my husband Robert passed away suddenly from a heart attack. We'd been married for 48 years, and losing him felt like having half my soul ripped away. But grief, I discovered, was a luxury I couldn't afford for long. Within days of the funeral, Marcus began showing his true colors in ways that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the son I'd raised. The first sign came during the reading of Robert's will. Marcus sat beside me in the lawyer's office, his leg bouncing with nervous energy as Mr. Henderson read through the documents. When it became clear that everything had been left to me, with provisions for Marcus only after my death, I watched my son's face transform. The grief I'd expected to see was replaced by something cold and calculating. "This doesn't make sense," Marcus had said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Dad always said the house would be mine. We talked about it just last month." Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses and looked at Marcus with the patience of someone who dealt with disappointed heirs before. "Your father was very clear about his wishes, Mr. Walsh. Everything passes to your mother, with the understanding that she'll make appropriate provisions for the family in her own will." But Marcus wasn't satisfied with waiting for nature to take its course. Over the following weeks, his visits became more frequent, and his requests more demanding. First, it was small things. Could he store some furniture in the basement? Could his girlfriend Stephanie move in temporarily while they looked for a new apartment? Could I help with his car payment since he was between jobs again? I'd said yes to everything, the way I always had. Marcus was 35 years old, but in my heart he was still the little boy who'd come running to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings. I'd been enabling his irresponsibility for years, always ready with money when he needed it, always willing to solve his problems before he had to face the consequences of his choices. The house Marcus coveted so desperately was a beautiful Victorian on Maple Street that Robert and I had bought as newlyweds in 1963. We'd paid $28,000 for it, which seemed like a fortune at the time. Now, according to recent appraisals, it was worth nearly $800,000. The neighborhood had transformed over the decades from working-class families to young professionals who appreciated the historic architecture and tree-lined streets. Robert and I had poured our hearts into that house. We'd restored the original hardwood floors, updated the kitchen 3 times, and spent countless weekends tending to the garden that was now featured in the local home and garden tour each spring. Every room held memories of the life we'd built together, from Marcus's first steps in the hallway to the Christmas mornings around the fireplace in the living room. Marcus had grown up in that house, but he'd never shown any real appreciation for it until he realized its monetary value. As a teenager, he'd complained constantly about living in an old house and begged us to move somewhere more modern. He'd left for college and rarely visited during holidays, always finding excuses to spend time with friends instead of family. After graduation, he'd moved to Chicago and called maybe once a month, usually when he needed something. It was only after Robert's diagnosis with heart problems 2 years ago that Marcus suddenly developed an interest in family visits. He'd started coming around more often, always asking questions about our finances, our insurance policies, and our plans for the future. At the time, I'd been touched by what I thought was his concern for our well-being. Now I realized he'd been conducting his own personal audit of his future inheritance. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday in October. I was in the kitchen making dinner when Marcus let himself in through the front door. He'd kept his key from high school and had never returned it, something that had never bothered me before but was starting to feel like an invasion of privacy. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, settling into Robert's chair at the kitchen table without being invited. His tone was serious, businesslike, completely different from the casual way he usually spoke to me. "Stephanie and I have been talking, and we think it's time to make some changes around here." I set down the wooden spoon I'd been using to stir the pasta sauce and turned to face him. "What kind of changes?" "This house is too big for one person. You're 71 years old, Mom. You shouldn't be trying to maintain a place this size by yourself. The stairs alone are dangerous for someone your age." His words were carefully chosen, delivered with the kind of false concern that made my skin crawl. "I'm managing just fine, Marcus. I've been taking care of this house for 60 years. "But that's just it," he continued, leaning forward with the intensity of someone delivering a prepared speech. "You don't have to manage anymore. Stephanie and I have been looking at assisted living facilities. There are some really nice places where you'd have people to help you. Activities to keep you busy, medical care if you need it." The pasta sauce began to bubble on the stove, but I ignored it. "Assisted living facilities? Marcus, I'm not an invalid. I drive, I cook, I take care of myself perfectly well." "For now," he said, and there was something almost threatening in his tone. "But what happens when you fall down those stairs? What happens when you forget to turn off the stove?" Stephanie's mother went through the same thing. It's better to make these decisions while you're still able to think clearly. The implication hung in the air between us, while I was still able to think clearly. As if my mental faculties were already in question, as if it was only a matter of time before I became incompetent to make my own decisions. "And I suppose you and Stephanie would move in here to take care of the house?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Marcus had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, but he pressed on anyway. "Well, it doesn't make sense to leave it empty. And we've been looking for a bigger place. Stephanie's pregnant, Mom. We're going to need the space." This was the first I'd heard about a pregnancy. "Congratulations," I said automatically, though the word felt hollow. "When is the baby due?" "April. Which is why we need to get this sorted out soon. Stephanie's going to need help with the baby, and it would be so much easier if we were living here instead of trying to visit you in some facility across town." I turned back to the stove and stirred the sauce, buying myself time to think. Everything about this conversation felt wrong. The timing, the approach, the assumption that I would simply go along with whatever plan he'd devised with his girlfriend. "Marcus, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to leave my home. This is where your father and I built our life together. This is where I want to stay." "Mom, be realistic. You can't afford to maintain this place on just Social Security and Dad's pension. The property taxes alone are $15,000 a year. Then there's insurance."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Utilities, maintenance, repairs. It's not sustainable. How did he know what our property taxes were? Robert had always handled our finances, but I'd been learning to manage them since his death. Marcus was right that money was tighter than it used to be, but I wasn't destitute. Between Social Security, Robert's pension, and our modest savings, I could afford to stay in the house for the foreseeable future. "I'm managing my finances just fine, thank you." "Are you?" Marcus pulled out his phone and started scrolling through what looked like a list of numbers. "Because I've been doing some research. Houses like this in this neighborhood require an average of $12,000 a year in maintenance costs. Your heating bill last winter was almost $3,000. When was the last time you had the roof inspected? The furnace serviced? The electrical system updated?" The level of detail in his research was disturbing. How long had he been planning this conversation? How long had he been treating my home like his future property instead of my current residence? "Marcus, I don't appreciate being lectured about my own finances in my own kitchen. If I need help managing my affairs, I'll ask for it." His demeanor shifted then, the false concern dropping away to reveal something much less pleasant underneath. "Mom, I'm trying to help you here, but if you're going to be stubborn about this, we might need to explore other options. What other options? Stephanie's cousin is a lawyer. He specializes in elder care issues. Sometimes families have to make difficult decisions when older relatives aren't thinking clearly anymore. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. If I didn't voluntarily agree to give up my home, Marcus was prepared to pursue legal means to force me out. The idea that my own son would try to have me declared incompetent to get his hands on my property made me feel physically sick. I think you should leave now, I said quietly. Mom, don't be like this. I'm trying to look out for your best interests. My best interests, or yours? Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the kitchen floor. Fine. If you want to be difficult about this, that's your choice. But don't expect me to keep bailing you out when things get tough. And don't expect me to feel guilty when you fall down those stairs or forget to pay your bills and lose the house anyway. He stormed out without saying goodbye, leaving me standing in my kitchen with the smell of burning pasta sauce filling the air. I turned off the burner and sank into the chair he'd just vacated, my hands shaking as the full weight of what had just happened settled over me. My son had just threatened to have me declared incompetent so he could take my home away from me. The child I'd raised, the young man I'd sacrificed for, the person I'd loved unconditionally for 35 years, was willing to destroy my life to get what he wanted. But Marcus had made one crucial mistake in his calculations. He'd assumed that I was a helpless old woman who would simply roll over and accept whatever fate he'd decided for me. He'd underestimated the woman who'd raised him as a single mother for the first 5 years of his life while Robert was serving overseas. He'd forgotten about the woman who'd worked night shifts at the hospital while going to nursing school during the day, so she could provide a better life for her family. Most importantly, he'd failed to realize that threatening someone you're supposed to love has consequences, and I was about to show him exactly what those consequences looked like. The next morning, I called my neighbor Eleanor, a retired teacher who'd lived across the street for almost as long as I'd been in the neighborhood. Eleanor was one of those people who seemed to know everything that happened on our street, often before the people involved knew it themselves. Eleanor, it's Catherine. Do you have a few minutes to talk? Of course, dear. Come on over, I just made coffee. Eleanor's kitchen was the warm, cluttered opposite of my own organized space. Plants crowded the windowsills, recipe clippings covered the refrigerator, and the table was buried under stacks of books and newspapers. She poured coffee into mismatched mugs and settled across from me with the expectant look of someone who knew she was about to hear something interesting. I need some advice, I said, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. About Marcus. Eleanor's expression grew serious. She'd known Marcus since he was a child, had watched him grow up from across the street. She'd also been one of the few people brave enough to comment on his behavior over the years, when I'd been too blind to see it myself. What's he done now? I told her about the conversation in my kitchen, about his threats and his plans to have me declared incompetent. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her face growing more grim with each detail. Catherine, that boy has been trouble since he was old enough to manipulate you into giving him what he wanted. Remember when he was 16 and convinced you to buy him that motorcycle by threatening to run away from home? I did remember. Marcus had worn me down over weeks of arguments, tantrums, and ultimatums, until I'd finally given in and bought him the bike he wanted. 3 months later, he'd crashed it while showing off for his friends and begged me not to tell Robert what had really happened. This is different, Eleanor. He's not a child anymore. He's talking about taking my home away from me. And he'll do it too if you let him. Catherine, you need to protect yourself. That boy has never faced real consequences for his actions, and now he thinks he can steamroll right over you to get what he wants. What am I supposed to do? He's my son. Eleanor reached across the table and took my hand. Honey, being someone's mother doesn't mean you have to let them destroy your life. You've given that boy everything you had to give. You put him through college, bailed him out of financial trouble more times than I can count, and supported him through every crisis and poor decision he's made. What has he ever given you in return besides heartache and demands for more? Her words stung because they were true. I'd been so focused on being a good mother that I'd forgotten I was also supposed to be teaching Marcus how to be a good person. Instead, I'd created someone who believed the world owed him whatever he wanted simply because he existed. You need to see a lawyer, Eleanor continued. Find out what your options are. And you need to do it before Marcus follows through on his threats. That afternoon, I made an appointment with Sarah Chen, an attorney who specialized in estate planning and elder law. Her office was in a renovated historic building downtown, and her credentials on the wall suggested she was exactly the kind of person I needed on my side. Sarah was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. I explained my situation as clearly as I could, trying to stick to the facts and not let my emotions color the story. "Mrs. Walsh," Sarah said when I'd finished, "I'm sorry you're going through this. Unfortunately, what you're describing is more common than you might think. Family members sometimes believe they're entitled to inheritances while their relatives are still alive, and they're willing to use intimidation or legal manipulation to get what they want. Is there anything Marcus can actually do legally? Can he really have me declared incompetent? It's possible, but it's not easy. He would need to petition the court and provide evidence that you're unable to manage your own affairs. That typically requires medical testimony, evidence of financial mismanagement, or documented incidents of dangerous behavior. From what you've told me, none of those factors apply to your situation." The relief I felt was enormous, but Sarah wasn't finished. However, the process itself can be traumatic and expensive, even if the petition is ultimately unsuccessful. And if Marcus is determined to pursue this route, you'll need to be prepared to defend yourself. What would that involve? Medical evaluations, psychological testing, financial audits. You'd need to prove your competency, which shouldn't be difficult given your current circumstances, but it would still be an ordeal. I thought about having to submit to tests and evaluations designed to prove I was capable of making my own decisions. The humiliation alone would be devastating, regardless of the outcome. Is there anything I can do to protect myself? Sarah opened a file folder and pulled out several documents. There are several steps we can take. First, we can create a comprehensive estate plan that clearly documents your mental competency and your wishes for your property. Second, we can set up safeguards that would make it difficult for anyone to challenge your decisions. And third, we can explore options for protecting your assets from potential legal challenges. We spent the next hour going through various legal strategies, but one option in particular caught my attention. Sarah explained that I could place my house in a trust, with myself as the beneficiary during my lifetime. This would protect the property from potential creditors or legal challenges, while still allowing me to live in it and make decisions about its future. The interesting thing about this type of trust, Sarah explained, is that you maintain complete control during your lifetime, but you also have the flexibility to change the ultimate beneficiaries if circumstances warrant it. What do you mean? Well, if someone were to threaten you or try to manipulate you into giving them your property, you could simply remove them as a beneficiary. They would have no legal claim to the trust assets, regardless of what they might expect to inherit. The idea was appealing, but it felt like such a drastic step. Was I really ready to disinherit my own son over one ugly conversation? As if reading my thoughts, Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Walsh, you don't have to make any final decisions today. We can set up the legal framework to protect you, and you can always modify your plans later if your relationship with your son improves. But right now, the most important thing is making sure you have options." I left Sarah's office with a folder full of documents and a follow-up appointment scheduled for the next week. The legal fees would be substantial, but the peace of mind was worth every penny. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt like I had some control over my own life. That evening, I sat in my living room looking through old photo albums. Pictures of Marcus as a baby, as a toddler taking his first steps, as a little boy on his first day of school. Had I seen signs of his selfishness even then? Or had I been so determined to give him everything I'd never had that I'd failed to teach him the value of gratitude and respect? The phone rang, interrupting my melancholy trip down memory lane. Marcus's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I considered not answering, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hi, Mom." His voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away about his mood or intentions. "Hello, Marcus. I wanted to apologize for yesterday. I think we both said some things we didn't mean. I was just worried about you, and maybe I didn't express that very well. This was classic Marcus behavior. Whenever he'd pushed too far and realized there might be consequences, he would backtrack and try to smooth things over with apologies and explanations. But he never actually changed his behavior, and he never took real responsibility for his actions. I appreciate the apology, I said carefully. Good. I was hoping we could start over and approach this whole situation differently. Maybe you'd like to come to dinner this weekend? Stephanie's making her famous lasagna, and we could talk about finding a solution that works for everyone. What kind of solution? Well, we've been thinking, maybe you don't need to move out right away. Maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement where we all live here together. Stephanie and I could help with the maintenance and expenses, and you'd have company and support when you need it. The offer sounded reasonable on the surface, but I could read between the lines. Marcus and Stephanie would move into my house, gradually take over more and more of the decision-making, and eventually push me out entirely. It would be a slower version of the same plan he'd proposed yesterday. I'll think about it, I said, which was true. I would think about it, and then I would reject it completely. Great. How about Sunday at 6? Stephanie's really excited to talk to you about the baby. After we hung up, I realized that Marcus had never actually apologized for threatening me. He'd apologized for the way he'd expressed his concerns, which was entirely different. He was still convinced that his plan was in my best interest, and he was still determined to make it happen one way or another. The dinner invitation was clearly intended to get me back under his influence, to make me feel guilty about rejecting his generous offer to take care of me. But I'd been manipulated by Marcus for too many years to fall for his tactics now. I had until Sunday to decide how I wanted to handle this situation. I could go to dinner and pretend to consider his proposal while I figured out my next move. Or I could refuse the invitation and force him to show his true colors more quickly. Either way, I was done being the helpless victim in this scenario. Marcus had made his position clear. He wanted my house, and he was willing to destroy our relationship to get it. Now it was time for him to learn that actions have consequences, and that threatening your mother is the kind of mistake you only get to make once. The weekend passed slowly as I wrestled with my decision about Sunday dinner. Part of me wanted to go, to see if there was any chance of salvaging my relationship with Marcus, but a larger part of me recognized that ship had already sailed. The moment he'd threatened to have me declared incompetent, he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. On Sunday morning, I called Marcus and declined the dinner invitation, citing a headache. It wasn't entirely a lie. The stress of the situation had been giving me tension headaches for days. Mom, are you sure? Stephanie's already started cooking, and we were really looking forward to talking with you. I'm sure. Maybe another time. There was a pause, and when Marcus spoke again, his voice had lost its artificial warmth. Okay. But we do need to discuss this situation soon. It's not going to resolve itself. The implied threat was back. Subtle but unmistakable. I was running out of time to voluntarily agree to his plans, and if I didn't cooperate soon, he would take more drastic measures. You're right, I said. We do need to resolve this. I'll be in touch. Monday morning, I called Sarah Chen and scheduled an emergency appointment. It was time to stop reacting to Marcus's threats and start taking proactive steps to protect myself. I want to set up that trust we discussed. I told Sarah when I arrived at her office, and I want to do it as quickly as possible. Sarah pulled out the documents we discussed the previous week. Have you given any thought to who you'd like to name as the ultimate beneficiary? That was the question I'd been avoiding. If I removed Marcus from my will entirely, there would be no going back. Our relationship would be over permanently. But if I left him as the beneficiary, I'd be rewarding his threats and manipulation. What are my options? You could name a charity, establish a scholarship fund, leave everything to other family members, or create a more complex arrangement that provides for specific people under certain conditions. An idea began to form in my mind. What if I wanted to leave the house to someone who would appreciate it? Someone who would take care of it the way Robert and I did? Do you have someone specific in mind? I thought about Eleanor, who'd been like a sister to me for decades. I thought about my niece, Jennifer, who lived on the other coast but had always been grateful for the help Robert and I had given her over the years. I thought about the young couple who'd moved in next door last year and had been so kind and helpful since Robert's death. I have a few ideas, but I want to make sure that if Marcus continues with his threats, he won't benefit from them in any way. Sarah nodded. We can definitely structure things that way. In fact, we can include specific language that would automatically disinherit anyone who challenges your competency or attempts to manipulate you into changing your will. The irony was perfect. If Marcus tried to force me out of my house, he would guarantee that he'd never inherit it. The very actions he was taking to secure his future would destroy it instead. We spent the rest of the morning working out the details of the trust and updating my will. By the time I left Sarah's office, I had legal documents that protected both my current security and my future autonomy. More importantly, I had a plan. That evening, I called Eleanor and asked if she'd like to come over for coffee. I needed to talk to someone I trusted about what I was considering, and Eleanor had always been brutally honest with me, even when I didn't want to hear it. "You're really going to disinherit him?" Eleanor asked after I'd explained my afternoon at the lawyer's office. "I don't know yet. The documents are set up so that I can change my mind if his behavior improves. But Eleanor, he threatened to have me declared incompetent so he could take my house. How do I come back from that?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "You know, I've watched that boy manipulate you for 35 years. Every time he got in trouble. Every time he needed money. Every time he made a poor decision. You were there to fix it for him. You never let him face real consequences for anything. I was trying to be a good mother. You were a wonderful mother, but sometimes being a good parent means letting your children learn from their mistakes. And sometimes it means protecting yourself when they become adults who are willing to hurt you to get what they want." She was right, of course. I'd spent so many years trying to shield Marcus from disappointment and hardship that I'd never taught him how to handle either one. Now, faced with the possibility that he might not inherit my house immediately, he was having the adult equivalent of a toddler tantrum. What if I'm wrong? What if he's genuinely concerned about my welfare? Eleanor gave me a look that suggested she thought I was being deliberately naive. "Catherine, people who are genuinely concerned about your welfare don't threaten to have you declared incompetent. They don't research your finances without permission. They don't show up with ultimatums and demands. Marcus isn't worried about your safety. He's worried about his inheritance." The truth of her words settled over me like a weight. My son didn't love me. He loved what I could give him. And now that Robert was gone and I was the only thing standing between Marcus and his inheritance, I'd become an obstacle to be removed rather than a person to be cherished. "The hardest part," I said quietly, "is that I keep hoping he'll realize what he's doing and apologize. Really apologize, not just try to manipulate me into forgetting about it. Honey, people like Marcus don't change unless they're forced to. And even then, they usually just get better at hiding their true nature. You can't love someone into being a better person, no matter how much you want to." That night, I lay in bed thinking about the little boy Marcus used to be, sweet and affectionate when he wanted something, sullen and manipulative when he didn't get his way. The signs had been there all along. I'd just been too invested in seeing the best in him to acknowledge the worst. Robert had tried to warn me over the years. He'd wanted to be tougher on Marcus, to make him face consequences for his actions. But I'd always intervened, always made excuses, always found ways to soften the blows that might have taught Marcus important lessons about responsibility and respect. Now Robert was gone, and I was dealing with the consequences of 35 years of enabling behavior. Marcus had learned that if he pushed hard enough, if he made enough threats or caused enough drama, I would eventually give him what he wanted. This situation was just a larger version of every other conflict we'd ever had. But this time was going to be different. This time, Marcus was going to learn that some lines shouldn't be crossed, and that threatening your mother has consequences he'd never imagined. 2 weeks later, Marcus showed up at my door with a manila folder and a confidence that made my stomach turn. He didn't knock or ring the bell, just used his key and walked in like he owned the place. Which, I was beginning to understand, was exactly how he saw the situation. "Mom, I brought someone I'd like you to meet," he called out as he headed toward my kitchen. Behind him walked a woman in her 50s, wearing a navy blue suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Her smile was professional but cold, the kind practiced by people who made their living convincing vulnerable seniors to sign away their independence. "This is Dr. Patricia Hawkins," Marcus said, gesturing toward the woman as they settled themselves at my kitchen table without invitation. "She specializes in geriatric psychology and has some excellent insights about your situation." Dr. Hawkins opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of forms. "Mrs. Walsh, your son has shared his concerns about your living situation. I understand you've been resistant to discussing more appropriate housing arrangements for someone in your demographic." "Someone in my demographic." The phrase was clearly designed to make me feel old and incompetent before the conversation even began. I remained standing while they made themselves comfortable in my space, sending a clear message that this meeting was not happening with my consent. "I haven't been resistant to anything because there's nothing to discuss. I'm perfectly capable of living in my own home." Dr. Hawkins made a note on one of her forms. "Resistance to change is very common in elderly patients, especially those experiencing the early stages of cognitive decline. It's natural to want to maintain familiar routines, even when they're no longer safe or practical." "Cognitive decline?" "I'm not experiencing any cognitive decline. Mrs. Walsh, according to your son, you've been exhibiting several concerning behaviors lately. Forgetting conversations, repeating yourself, having difficulty managing your finances. These are all early warning signs that family members are often the first to notice." I looked at Marcus, who was avoiding my eyes by studying the papers Dr. Hawkins had spread across my table. "What conversations am I supposed to have forgotten? What financial difficulties am I supposed to be having?" Marcus finally looked up, his expression carefully arranged to convey concerned patience. "Mom, last week you called me 3 times asking the same question about Dad's insurance policy. And Mrs. Henderson mentioned that you seemed confused when she tried to return the casserole dish you'd given her. Both statements were complete fabrications. I'd called Marcus once about insurance paperwork I needed help locating, and Mrs. Henderson had never borrowed any casserole dish from me. But Dr. Hawkins was writing everything down as if these were documented medical symptoms rather than outright lies." "Those things never happened," I said firmly. Dr. Hawkins looked up from her notes with an expression of practiced sympathy. "Memory loss often affects patients' ability to recall their own symptoms. That's why family observations are so important in making accurate assessments." The circular logic was maddening. If I remembered the conversations, I was competent. If I didn't remember them, I was incompetent. If I denied they'd happened at all, that was proof of memory loss. No matter how I responded, Dr. Hawkins would find a way to pathologize my answers. "I'd like to conduct a brief cognitive assessment," Dr. Hawkins continued, pulling out what looked like a standardized test form. "Just some simple questions to establish a baseline for your current functioning level. I don't consent to any assessment. I want both of you to leave my house immediately." Marcus leaned forward with an expression of exaggerated concern. "Mom, Dr. Hawkins is just trying to help. If you really are fine, then the assessment will prove that. Why would you refuse unless you're worried about the results?" Another trap. Refusing the test would be seen as evidence of incompetence, while taking it would legitimize their claim that my mental state was in question. Either way, they could use my response as ammunition for whatever legal proceedings Marcus was planning. Because I don't need to prove my competence to anyone, especially not to people who've entered my home without permission and are making false accusations about my mental health. Dr. Hawkins made another note. Paranoid ideation is another common symptom in patients with early-stage dementia. The feeling that people are conspiring against them often develops as their ability to process complex social situations declines. I realized that nothing I said would matter. Dr. Hawkins had already decided what narrative she wanted to construct, and she would interpret any response I gave to fit that story. The assessment was a sham, designed to provide documentation for Marcus's legal challenge, not a genuine evaluation of my capabilities. "I'm calling the police," I said, reaching for the phone. "Mom, there's no need for that," Marcus said quickly, but I could see panic flash across his face. Whatever plan he and Dr. Hawkins had developed, it apparently didn't account for law enforcement involvement. I dialed 911, and explained that I had uninvited people in my home who were refusing to leave when asked. The dispatcher told me an officer would be there within 10 minutes. Dr. Hawkins was hastily packing up her papers. "Mrs. Walsh, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was simply offering to provide some resources that might be helpful for your situation. The only misunderstanding is that you thought you could come into my home and manipulate me into signing away my independence. Now please leave before the police arrive." Marcus stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Mom, you're making a huge mistake. Dr. Hawkins was trying to help you, and you're acting like a paranoid crazy person. This is exactly the kind of behavior that proves you need supervision. The only thing this proves is that you're willing to lie about my mental health to get what you want. How much are you paying her, Marcus? What did you promise her in exchange for a diagnosis that would make me incompetent?" Dr. Hawkins grabbed her briefcase and headed for the door. "I think it's best if we reschedule this conversation for another time." "There won't be another time," I called after her. "And if I find out you're actually a licensed psychologist, I'll be filing a complaint with the state board about your unethical assessment practices." They left just as the police car pulled into my driveway. Officer Martinez was young and professional, and he listened carefully as I explained what had happened. He took down Marcus's information and Dr. Hawkins's business card, which she'd left behind in her hurry to escape. "Ma'am, do you want to file a complaint for trespassing?" I considered it for a moment. Having Marcus arrested would certainly send a clear message about how seriously I took his threats. But it would also escalate the situation in ways that might be difficult to control. Not at this time, but I want this incident documented in case there are future problems. Officer Martinez wrote up a report and gave me a case number. "Ma'am, if these people come back without your permission, don't hesitate to call us again. And if you're concerned about elder abuse or financial exploitation, there are resources available to help you." After he left, I sat in my kitchen trying to process what had just happened. Marcus had brought a fake psychologist to my house to conduct a sham evaluation designed to prove I was incompetent. The level of premeditation and manipulation involved was breathtaking. I called Sarah Chen and left a voicemail describing the incident. She called back within an hour, and her voice was tight with anger when I finished recounting the story. "Catherine, what Marcus and this Dr. Hawkins person attempted today was probably illegal. Using fraudulent psychological evaluations to support competency challenges is a serious offense. I think we need to take more aggressive action to protect you." "What kind of action?" "First, I'm going to have my investigator look into Dr. Hawkins's credentials. If she's not actually licensed, or if she's operating outside the scope of her license, we can file complaints with the appropriate regulatory bodies. Second, I think we should consider getting a restraining order against Marcus. The idea of getting a restraining order against my own son felt like admitting complete failure as a mother. But the alternative was continuing to live under the constant threat of his manipulation and intimidation. What would that involve? We'd petition the court for an order prohibiting Marcus from entering your property or contacting you without permission. Given today's incident and his previous threats, I think we have strong grounds for the petition. But he's my son. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "Catherine, being someone's parent doesn't mean you have to tolerate abuse. What Marcus is doing to you is a form of elder abuse, and you have the right to protect yourself from it." That evening, I called my sister Margaret in Phoenix. We'd grown apart over the years, partly because of geography, and partly because she'd never liked Marcus, and had made no secret of her opinion that I spoiled him. But I needed to talk to someone who'd known me before I became Marcus's mother, someone who could remind me of who I used to be. "Kathy?" Margaret's voice was surprised but pleased. "It's been ages since I've heard from you. How are you holding up since Robert's passing?" I told her everything. About Marcus's demands that I move out, about his threats to have me declared incompetent, about the fake psychologist he'd brought to my house. Margaret listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Kathy, I've been waiting 30 years for you to realize what that boy really is. I'm just sorry it took Robert's death for you to see it." "Margaret, he's not evil, he's just what? Selfish? Manipulative? Willing to destroy his own mother to get what he wants?" Honey, those aren't character flaws. Those are serious personality defects. But I raised him. If he's like this, it's because I failed somewhere. You didn't fail. You loved him. Sometimes that's not enough to fix what's broken in a person. And sometimes trying to fix them just enables them to keep hurting people. Margaret was right, of course. I had been enabling Marcus's behavior for so long that I'd lost sight of where motherly love ended and codependency began. But acknowledging that truth meant accepting that the child I'd devoted my life to raising had become someone capable of real cruelty. What am I supposed to do now? You're supposed to protect yourself. That boy has made his choice about what kind of person he wants to be. Now you get to make your choice about how you want to respond. The next morning, I called Sarah and told her to proceed with the restraining order. If Marcus wanted to treat me like an enemy, then I would start protecting myself like one. The court hearing was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, I had my locks changed and installed a security system with cameras covering all the entrances to my house. The young man who installed the system was sympathetic when I explained that I was having problems with unwanted visitors. "Ma'am, this system will record everything and upload it to the cloud automatically. If anyone tries to enter your property without permission, you'll have video evidence." I also contacted my bank and added additional security measures to my accounts. If Marcus was desperate enough to attempt financial fraud, I wanted to make sure he couldn't access my money even if he somehow got hold of my account information. 3 days after the incident with Dr. Hawkins, Marcus called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Mom, I think we need to clear the air about what happened the other day." "There's nothing to clear up. You brought a fake psychologist to my house to conduct a fraudulent evaluation." "She's not fake. Dr. Hawkins is a licensed professional with years of experience in geriatric psychology." "Then why did she run away when I mentioned calling the police? Why didn't she have proper credentials with her? Why was she willing to make diagnoses based on secondhand information and fabricated symptoms?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Mom, I think you misunderstood what was happening. Dr. Hawkins was just offering to provide some resources and support services. She wasn't trying to diagnose you with anything." The gaslighting was so blatant it was almost insulting. Marcus was actually trying to convince me that I'd imagined or misinterpreted what had clearly been an attempt to declare me incompetent. "Marcus, I recorded the entire conversation." That was a lie, but it had the desired effect. Marcus's voice changed immediately, becoming defensive and aggressive. "You recorded us without our consent? That's illegal, Mom." "Actually, it's not. Illinois is a one-party consent state, which means I can record any conversation I'm part of without informing the other parties. And if you and Dr. Hawkins were really just offering resources and support, why would you be worried about a recording?" The silence stretched out long enough that I wondered if Marcus had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and flat. "You know what, Mom? I was trying to help you, but if you want to be paranoid and difficult, that's your choice. Don't call me when you fall down those stairs or forget to pay your bills and lose the house." "I won't be calling you for anything, Marcus, and if you come to my house again without permission, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." "We'll see about that." The line went dead, leaving me with the distinct impression that Marcus's next move would be even more aggressive than his previous attempts, but I was no longer the helpless victim he thought I was. I had legal protection, security systems, and most importantly, I had finally stopped pretending that this was a normal family disagreement that could be resolved with compromise and understanding. The restraining order hearing took place on a rainy Thursday morning in a courthouse that smelled like old wood and disinfectant. Marcus arrived with a lawyer, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit who immediately began challenging the basis for my petition. "Your Honor, Mrs. Walsh is clearly experiencing age-related confusion about normal family interactions. Her son has been trying to help her plan for her future care needs, and she's interpreting his concern as some kind of threat." Sarah stood up to respond. "Your Honor, we have documentation of Mr. Walsh's threats to have his mother declared incompetent, as well as a police report from an incident where he brought an unlicensed individual to conduct a fraudulent psychological evaluation." The judge looked through the paperwork Sarah had filed, including Officer Martinez's report and the business card Dr. Hawkins had left behind. Ms. Roberts, are you claiming that your client never threatened to challenge his mother's competency? Marcus's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, expressing concern about an elderly parent's welfare is not the same as making threats. What about the incident with Dr. Hawkins? Dr. Hawkins is a licensed psychologist who was simply offering to provide resources and support services. Mrs. Walsh misinterpreted the nature of the consultation. Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a document. Your Honor, our investigation revealed that Dr. Patricia Hawkins' license was suspended 6 months ago for conducting evaluations outside the scope of her credentials. She is not currently authorized to practice psychology in the state of Illinois. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. Marcus's face had gone pale, and his lawyer was frantically whispering something in his ear. The judge looked directly at Marcus. Mr. Walsh, did you need to clear the air about what happened the other day? There's nothing to clear up. You brought a fake psychologist to my house to conduct a fraudulent evaluation. She's not fake. Dr. Hawkins is a licensed professional with years of experience in geriatric psychology. Then why did she run away when I mentioned calling the police? Why didn't she have proper credentials with her? Why was she willing to make diagnoses based on secondhand information and fabricated symptoms? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Mom, I think you misunderstood what was happening. Dr. Hawkins was just offering to provide some resources and support services. She wasn't trying to diagnose you with anything. The gaslighting was so blatant, it was almost insulting. Marcus was actually trying to convince me that I'd imagined or misinterpreted what had clearly been an attempt to declare me incompetent. Marcus, I recorded the entire conversation. That was a lie, but it had the desired effect. Marcus's voice changed immediately, becoming defensive and aggressive. You recorded us without our consent? That's illegal, Mom. Actually, it's not. Illinois is a one-party consent state, which means I can record any conversation I'm part of without informing the other parties. And if you and Dr. Hawkins were really just offering resources and support, why would you be worried about a recording? The silence stretched out long enough that I wondered if Marcus had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and flat. You know what, Mom? I was trying to help you, but if you want to be paranoid and difficult, that's your choice. Don't call me when you fall down those stairs, or forget to pay your bills and lose the house. I won't be calling you for anything, Marcus. And if you come to my house again without permission, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. We'll see about that. The line went dead, leaving me with the distinct impression that Marcus's next move would be even more aggressive than his previous attempts. But I was no longer the helpless victim he thought I was. I had legal protection, security systems, and most importantly, I had finally stopped pretending that this was a normal family disagreement that could be resolved with compromise and understanding. The restraining order hearing took place on a rainy Thursday morning in a courthouse that smelled like old wood and disinfectant. Marcus arrived with a lawyer, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit who immediately began challenging the basis for my petition. Your Honor, Mrs. Walsh is clearly experiencing age-related confusion about normal family interactions. Her son has been trying to help her plan for her future care needs, and she's interpreting his concern as some kind of threat. Sarah stood up to respond. Your Honor, we have documentation of Mr. Walsh's threats to have his mother declared incompetent, as well as a police report from an incident where he brought an unlicensed individual to conduct a fraudulent psychological evaluation. The judge looked through the paperwork Sarah had filed, including Officer Martinez's report and the business card Dr. Hawkins had left behind. Ms. Roberts, are you claiming that your client never threatened to challenge his mother's competency? Marcus's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, expressing concern about an elderly parent's welfare is not the same as making threats. What about the incident with Dr. Hawkins? Dr. Hawkins is a licensed psychologist who was simply offering to provide resources and support services. Mrs. Walsh misinterpreted the nature of the consultation. Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a document. Your Honor, our investigation revealed that Dr. Patricia Hawkins' license was suspended 6 months ago for conducting evaluations outside the scope of her credentials. She is not currently authorized to practice psychology in the state of Illinois. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. Marcus's face had gone pale, and his lawyer was frantically whispering something in his ear. The judge looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Walsh, did you?" Stephanie's friendly demeanor evaporated. "You know what? Marcus was right about you. You are a bitter old woman who cares more about money than family. That baby is your grandchild, and you're going to regret pushing us away." She threw the gift package at my front door and stormed off, but not before my security cameras captured the entire interaction. I called Sarah and sent her the video footage, and she immediately filed a motion with the court documenting the violation. "Catherine, this kind of behavior usually escalates before it gets better. Marcus is testing the boundaries of the restraining order to see what he can get away with. We need to make sure there are immediate consequences for any violations." The judge was not amused when he reviewed the video footage. He extended the restraining order for another 6 months and warned Marcus's lawyer that any further violations would result in jail time. He also expanded the order to include Stephanie and any other third parties Marcus might use to circumvent the restrictions. As spring turned to summer, my life began to settle into a new routine. I joined a gardening club and started volunteering at the local hospital where I'd worked as a nurse decades earlier. The social connections I'd been missing since Robert's death slowly began to rebuild, and I realized how isolated I'd become while dealing with Marcus's demands and threats. The house felt peaceful again. I could come and go without worrying about finding unwanted visitors in my kitchen. I could answer my phone without dreading manipulative conversations about my supposed incompetence. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt like I was living my own life instead of just surviving someone else's agenda. But I knew Marcus hadn't given up. The restraining order was a temporary solution, and determined people always found ways around legal obstacles. I needed to be prepared for whatever he tried next, and I needed to make sure that when he made his next move, it would backfire spectacularly. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 3 months after the restraining order was extended, my neighbor Tom knocked on my door with a concerned expression. "Catherine, I thought you should know that someone's been asking questions about you around the neighborhood. A private investigator, I think. He's been talking to people about your daily routine, whether you seem confused or forgetful, that sort of thing." My blood ran cold. Marcus was building a case for a competency challenge, gathering testimony from neighbors who might be willing to say I was showing signs of mental decline. It was exactly the kind of thing his lawyer had threatened to do after the restraining order hearing. What kind of questions was he asking? Whether you ever seemed disoriented, if you repeated yourself in conversations, if you had trouble remembering things. He also asked about your driving and whether anyone had noticed you leaving appliances on or forgetting to lock your doors. I thanked Tom and immediately called Sarah. If Marcus wanted to play investigator, then it was time to turn the tables and show him what real investigation looked like. "Catherine, hiring a private investigator to gather evidence for a competency challenge is perfectly legal, but it also tells us what Marcus is planning. We need to be proactive about documenting your cognitive function and daily living skills." "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're going to have you evaluated by a real geriatric psychologist. Someone with impeccable credentials who can provide testimony about your mental competence. We're also going to document your independence and decision-making capabilities in ways that will be difficult for Marcus to challenge." The evaluation took place the following week with Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, a psychologist who specialized in competency assessments for legal proceedings. Unlike Dr. Hawkins, Dr. Morgan had proper credentials, conducted the evaluation in her own office, and spent nearly 3 hours administering comprehensive tests. "Mrs. Walsh, your cognitive function is well within normal limits for someone your age. In fact, your scores on several tests are above average. You show no signs of dementia, depression, or any other condition that would impair your judgment or decision-making abilities." Dr. Morgan's written report was 20 pages of detailed analysis and test results that would be impossible for Marcus to dispute. Sarah also arranged for me to have medical and psychiatric evaluations that confirmed my physical and mental health. "Now," Sarah said, "we wait for Marcus to make his move. And when he does, we'll be ready for him." The waiting didn't last long, 4 weeks later, I received a summons to appear in court for a competency hearing. Marcus had filed a petition claiming I was suffering from dementia and was unable to manage my own affairs. He was requesting to be appointed as my guardian with full control over my finances and living situation. Reading through Marcus's petition was like looking at a distorted, funhouse mirror version of my life. According to his filing, I was a confused, forgetful old woman who wandered around my house at night, forgot to eat meals, and had repeatedly expressed paranoid delusions about family members trying to harm me. The petition included statements from 3 neighbors who claimed to have witnessed concerning behavior, though I suspected their testimony had been incentivized in some way. It also referenced my irrational decision to obtain a restraining order against my own son as evidence of paranoid thinking. But Marcus had made a critical error in his legal strategy. In his eagerness to paint me as incompetent, he'd also documented his own manipulative behavior. The petition included details about his financial research into my assets, his coordination with Dr. Hawkins, and his belief that he was entitled to control my property. Sarah read through the petition with growing amazement. "Catherine, Marcus has basically confessed to elder abuse in his own court filing. He's documented his attempts to manipulate you, his use of fraudulent psychological evaluations, and his belief that your money belongs to him. This isn't a competency petition, it's evidence for a criminal case." The competency hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks away, giving us time to prepare a comprehensive defense. But Sarah had a different strategy in mind. "Instead of just defending against Marcus's petition, I think we should go on the offensive. We're going to file our own petition, asking the court to find that Marcus has been engaging in elder abuse and financial exploitation. We're going to ask for sanctions against him and his lawyer for filing a frivolous lawsuit." The thought of taking aggressive legal action against my own son was terrifying, but I was tired of being on the defensive. Marcus had declared war on my independence and dignity. It was time to show him that wars have casualties on both sides. The courthouse steps felt different this time as I walked up them with Sarah by my side. 6 months ago, I'd been the defendant, seeking protection from my own son. Today, I was the plaintiff, armed with evidence that would expose Marcus's manipulation for what it really was. Sarah had spent weeks preparing our counterpetition, and the documents in her briefcase told a story that even Marcus couldn't spin in his favor. Bank records showing his history of financial dependency, recordings of his threats, testimony from neighbors who'd witnessed his aggressive behavior, and most damaging of all, the trail of evidence he'd left while trying to build his case against me. "Remember, Catherine," Sarah said as we entered the building, "today isn't about proving you're competent. That was never really in question. Today is about showing the court what Marcus has been doing to you, and making sure he faces consequences for it." Judge Harrison had been assigned to hear both petitions, Marcus's request for guardianship, and our counterpetition alleging elder abuse. He was known for his no-nonsense approach to family law cases, and Sarah had warned me that he had little patience for people who used the legal system to manipulate elderly relatives. Marcus arrived with his lawyer and what appeared to be a small army of witnesses. I recognized 2 of them as neighbors from my street, though I couldn't imagine what they could possibly testify about since I barely knew them. The third was a woman I'd never seen before, professionally dressed and carrying a briefcase that suggested she was some kind of expert witness. "Your Honor," Marcus's lawyer began, "my client is here today because he loves his mother and is deeply concerned about her welfare. Mrs. Walsh has been exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior since her husband's death, and her family is worried that she's no longer capable of making sound decisions about her care and finances." She painted a picture of a confused, paranoid old woman who'd turned against her loving family and was making dangerous choices that put her at risk. According to their narrative, the restraining order was evidence of my declining mental state, not protection from abuse. Mrs. Walsh has become convinced that her son is trying to steal from her, despite the fact that he's been trying to help her plan for her future care needs. She's isolated herself from family members who care about her, and she's making financial decisions that suggest significant cognitive impairment. The first witness was Mrs. Peterson from down the street, a woman I'd spoken to maybe 3 times in 20 years. She testified that she'd seen me, quote, "wandering around my yard at odd hours," and that I'd seemed confused and disoriented during our brief conversations. Sarah's cross-examination was swift and devastating. "Mrs. Peterson, when you say you saw Mrs. Walsh wandering around her yard, what specifically was she doing?" "Well, she was just walking around, looking at things." "Looking at what things?" "I don't know. Plants, I guess." "So she was gardening? In her own yard?" "I suppose so. And when you say she seemed confused during your conversations, can you give me a specific example of what she said that seemed confused?" Mrs. Peterson's face flushed. "I don't remember exactly. It was just a feeling I had." "A feeling. Based on conversations you can't remember with a woman you've spoken to 3 times in 20 years. The second neighbor fared no better under cross-examination, admitting that his concerns were based entirely on what Marcus had told him, rather than anything he'd observed directly. By the time Sarah was finished with them, it was clear that their testimony had been coached and was essentially worthless. The expert witness was Dr. Rebecca Foster, a psychologist who specialized in geriatric assessments. Marcus's lawyer had hired her to review my case file and provide an opinion about my mental state. Based on my review of the available information, Dr. Foster testified, "I believe Mrs. Walsh is exhibiting signs of paranoid ideation and possible early-stage dementia." Her decision to obtain a restraining order against her own son, combined with her resistance to appropriate care planning, suggests significant impairment in her judgment. Sarah stood up for cross-examination with a smile that made me almost feel sorry for Dr. Foster. "Dr. Foster, did you personally examine Mrs. Walsh before forming this opinion?" "No, but I reviewed extensive documentation about her behavior and decision-making patterns." "What documentation specifically?" "Reports from family members, witness statements, and legal filings." "Did you review any medical records?" "No medical records were provided to me." "Did you review any actual psychological evaluations of Mrs. Walsh?" "No formal evaluations were available." "So your opinion about Mrs. Walsh's mental state is based entirely on secondhand reports from people who are seeking to have her declared incompetent?" Dr. Foster looked uncomfortable. "I based my assessment on the available information." "Dr. Foster, are you aware that Mrs. Walsh underwent comprehensive psychological and medical evaluations just 6 weeks ago?" "I was not provided with those evaluations." Sarah walked to the plaintiff's table and picked up a thick folder. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit these evaluations into evidence. They were conducted by Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, a board-certified geriatric psychologist, and Dr. James Patterson, a geriatrician with 30 years of experience." She handed copies to the judge and to Marcus's lawyer, whose face went pale as she scanned the documents. "Dr. Foster, I'm handing you Dr. Morgan's evaluation. Could you please read the summary conclusion on page 18? Dr. Foster's voice was barely audible as she read, "Patient demonstrates cognitive function well within normal limits for her age group. No evidence of dementia, depression, or any other condition that would impair judgment or decision-making capabilities. Patient shows excellent insight into her circumstances and demonstrates appropriate protective behaviors in response to potential exploitation." Dr. Foster, does this evaluation change your opinion about Mrs. Walsh's mental competence? "I would need to review the full evaluation to form a complete opinion, but based on what you just read, would you say your previous assessment was accurate?" Marcus's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. Dr. Foster had been exposed as someone willing to provide expert testimony without having examined the patient or reviewed relevant medical records. When it was our turn to present evidence, Sarah methodically walked the court through Marcus's pattern of manipulation and threats. She played the recording of his conversation where he'd threatened to have me declared incompetent. She presented bank records showing his history of financial dependency and sudden interest in my assets after Robert's death. Most damaging of all, she presented evidence about Dr. Hawkins and the fraudulent evaluation Marcus had attempted to arrange. Your Honor, Mr. Walsh hired an unlicensed psychologist to conduct a fake evaluation of his mother. When that failed, he hired a private investigator to gather evidence from neighbors. When that wasn't sufficient, he filed this frivolous petition based on coach testimony and expert opinions from someone who never examined the patient. Sarah called Dr. Morgan to testify about my actual mental state. Dr. Morgan's credentials were impeccable, and her testimony was clear and professional. Mrs. Walsh demonstrates excellent cognitive function for someone her age. She's articulate, logical, and shows appropriate judgment in protecting herself from potential exploitation. Her decision to obtain a restraining order was a rational response to documented threats, not evidence of paranoid thinking. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Eleanor had asked to speak at the hearing, and Judge Harrison allowed her to address the court as a character witness. Your Honor, I've lived across the street from Catherine Walsh for 32 years. I watched her raise Marcus as a single mother while her husband was deployed overseas. I watched her work multiple jobs to put that boy through college. I watched her sacrifice everything she had to give him opportunities she never had herself. Eleanor's voice was steady, but filled with emotion. I also watched Marcus take advantage of his mother's generosity for decades. Every time he needed money, every time he made a poor decision, every time he got in trouble, Catherine was there to fix it for him. She never let him face real consequences for anything. She turned to look directly at Marcus. But threatening to have your mother declared incompetent so you can steal her house? That's not family concern. That's elder abuse, pure and simple. Marcus's lawyer tried to object, but Judge Harrison allowed Eleanor to continue. Marcus Walsh is not a concerned son trying to protect his mother. He's a greedy adult child who thinks he's entitled to his inheritance while his mother is still alive. And when she wouldn't voluntarily give him what he wanted, he decided to take it by force. The judge called a recess to review the evidence, and Marcus's lawyer spent the break in heated conversation with her client. I could see Marcus growing more agitated as the reality of his situation became clear. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison's expression was grim. I've reviewed all the evidence presented today, and I'm prepared to rule on both petitions. Mr. Walsh's petition for guardianship is denied. The evidence clearly shows that Mrs. Walsh is mentally competent and capable of managing her own affairs. Marcus's face went white, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, I find that Mr. Walsh's petition was filed in bad faith and constitutes an abuse of the legal process. The evidence shows a pattern of manipulation, intimidation, and attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person. The judge turned to look directly at Marcus. Mr. Walsh, your behavior toward your mother has been reprehensible. You've threatened her, manipulated her, and attempted to use fraudulent means to gain control of her assets. This court will not tolerate such abuse of elderly persons. He granted our counterpetition in full, extending the restraining order indefinitely, and ordering Marcus to pay our legal fees. He also referred the case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges related to elder abuse and fraud. Mrs. Walsh, the judge said, addressing me directly, I want you to know that protecting yourself from this kind of manipulation was exactly the right thing to do. No one should have to endure threats and intimidation from their own family members. As we left the courthouse, Marcus tried to approach me one last time. Sarah immediately stepped between us, reminding him that the restraining order was still in effect. But Marcus shouted over her shoulder anyway. Mom, you're going to regret this. You're choosing strangers over your own family. When you're old and alone, don't expect me to help you. I turned to face him, and for the first time in months I felt completely calm and in control. Marcus, I'm already old, and I've been alone since your father died. The difference is, now I'm alone by choice, instead of being surrounded by people who want to hurt me. His face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw the little boy he used to be. But that little boy was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. I loved you more than my own life, I continued. I gave you everything I had to give. But love doesn't mean letting someone destroy you. And I won't let anyone do that to me, not even you. I walked away then, leaving Marcus standing on the courthouse steps with his lawyer and his failed schemes. For the first time in months, I felt truly free. The drive home was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet, rather than the tense silence I'd grown accustomed to. Sarah had invited me to lunch to celebrate our victory, but all I wanted was to go home to my house, my garden, and my life. That evening, I called Margaret to tell her about the court hearing. She was practically cheering by the time I finished the story. "Kathy, I'm so proud of you. You finally stood up to that boy, and you won." "I don't feel like I won anything. I lost my son today." "Honey, you lost your son years ago. Today, you just stopped pretending he was still there." Margaret was right, of course. The Marcus I'd raised, the sweet little boy who'd crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, had been gone for a long time. The man who'd threatened to have me declared incompetent was a stranger who happened to share DNA with someone I used to love. Over the following weeks, I began to rebuild my life in earnest. I joined a book club at the library, started volunteering at the animal shelter, and even began taking watercolor painting classes at the community center. For 60 years, I'd defined myself primarily as a wife and mother. Now, for the first time, I was discovering who Catherine Walsh was when she wasn't taking care of everyone else. The house felt peaceful again. I could answer my phone without dreading manipulative conversations. I could go to bed without worrying about finding unwanted visitors in my kitchen the next morning. I could make decisions about my own life without having to justify them to someone who saw me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a person to respect. 2 months after the court hearing, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short, handwritten note from Stephanie. "Mrs. Walsh, I wanted you to know that the baby was born last week. A healthy girl we named Emma. I also wanted you to apologize for the way I acted when I came to your house. Marcus told me you were trying to keep him from his inheritance, but I realize now that wasn't true. I hope someday you'll want to meet your granddaughter." The note was signed simply Stephanie, and it included a single photograph of a tiny baby with dark hair and serious eyes. I stared at the photo for a long time, feeling a complex mix of emotions. This child was my granddaughter, an innocent person who had no responsibility for her father's actions. But she was also Marcus's daughter, being raised by someone who'd participated in his attempts to manipulate me. I tucked the photo into my jewelry box, next to the pictures of Marcus as a baby. Maybe someday, when Emma was old enough to understand, I could explain to her why her grandmother had to choose her own safety over a relationship with her son. Maybe someday, Marcus would grow up enough to realize what he'd lost when he chose money over family. But those possibilities were for the future. Right now, I had my own life to live. 3 months later, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. I put my house on the market. The decision wasn't based on fear or pressure from anyone else. It was based on the simple realization that I no longer needed to cling to the past to feel secure. The house on Maple Street had been perfect for raising a family, but now it was just me, and I was ready for something different. The real estate market was hot, and the house sold within 2 weeks for well above the asking price. The young couple who bought it reminded me of Robert and myself 40 years earlier, full of dreams and plans for the future they would build together. I used the proceeds to buy a beautiful condominium in a 55-plus community about 20 minutes away. It had a small garden space, a community center with activities and classes, and most importantly, security features that meant I never had to worry about unwanted visitors. I also established the Robert Walsh Memorial Scholarship Fund at the local community college, supporting students who wanted to pursue careers in nursing. The fund was substantial enough to help dozens of students over the years, creating a legacy that honored Robert's memory while doing genuine good in the world. On moving day, Eleanor came over to say goodbye. We'd maintained our friendship despite the distance, but it wouldn't be the same as having her right across the street. "You know," she said as we watched the movers load the last of my furniture, "I never thought I'd see the day when you'd voluntarily leave this house." "Neither did I, but houses are just buildings. Home is wherever you feel safe and happy." "What about Marcus? Do you think he knows you're moving?" "Probably. The sale was public record, and I'm sure he's been keeping track of my finances." I looked at the house one last time, remembering all the dreams Robert and I had shared within those walls. But it doesn't matter what Marcus knows or doesn't know. I'm not making decisions based on his reactions anymore. Eleanor hugged me goodbye, and I drove away from Maple Street without looking back. My new condominium was everything I'd hoped for, and more. The community was filled with active, interesting people who'd also chosen to start new chapters of their lives. I made friends quickly, joined committees, and even started dating a widower named Frank, who shared my love of gardening and old movies. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt genuinely happy. Not just content or resigned, but actively glad to wake up each morning and see what the day would bring. 6 months after the move, I received a phone call that I'd been half expecting. "Mrs. Walsh, this is Detective Rivera with the District Attorney's Office. I'm calling to let you know that we've decided to file criminal charges against your son for elder abuse and attempted fraud." The investigation had taken months, but the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus's attempts to manipulate me, his use of fraudulent psychological evaluations, and his pattern of financial exploitation all constituted criminal behavior under Illinois elder abuse statutes. "We'd like you to testify at his trial if you're willing." I thought about it for a moment. Testifying would mean facing Marcus in court again, reliving all the pain and betrayal of the past year. But it would also mean ensuring that other elderly people might be protected from similar abuse. "Yes," I said, "I'll testify." The trial took place 8 months later. Marcus had hired a new lawyer, someone more competent than the woman who'd represented him in the civil proceedings. But even skilled legal representation couldn't overcome the mountain of evidence against him. The prosecution presented recordings of his threats, documentation of his financial manipulation, evidence of the fraudulent evaluation scheme, and testimony from multiple witnesses who'd observed his aggressive behavior. When it was my turn to testify, I spoke clearly and calmly about everything that had happened. I didn't let emotion color my words. I simply told the truth about what my son had done to me and why I'd been forced to protect myself from him. Marcus's lawyer tried to portray me as a vindictive mother who was punishing her son for normal family disagreements, but the evidence spoke for itself, and the jury saw through the defense's attempts to minimize Marcus's actions. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Marcus was sentenced to 2 years in prison, suspended to 1 year of probation conditional on completing anger management counseling, and paying full restitution for my legal fees. As the judge read the sentence, I watched Marcus's face crumple. For a moment, he looked like the little boy I'd once rocked to sleep, and my heart ached for the person he might have been if I'd been a better parent or if he'd made different choices. But the moment passed, and I reminded myself that this was the consequence of his actions, not mine. I'd given him every opportunity to change course, to treat me with respect and dignity. He'd chosen greed and manipulation instead. After the trial, Marcus's lawyer approached me in the hallway. "Mrs. Walsh, my client would like to speak with you." I looked across the hallway to where Marcus stood with his head down, looking smaller and older than I remembered. "He wants to apologize," the lawyer continued. "Really apologize, not just try to manipulate you into dropping the charges." I considered it for a moment. Part of me wanted to hear what Marcus had to say, to see if there was any genuine remorse or understanding of what he'd done. But a larger part of me recognized that I didn't owe him anything, not even the opportunity to clear his conscience. Tell him that if he wants to apologize, he can write me a letter. But I'm not going to give him the chance to manipulate me again, even if that wasn't his intention. I walked away then, leaving Marcus to deal with the consequences of his choices without my help for the first time in his life. A month later, I did receive a letter from Marcus. It was 3 pages long, handwritten on prison stationery, and it was the most honest communication I'd ever received from him. He admitted that he'd been wrong to threaten me, wrong to try to manipulate me, and wrong to feel entitled to my property. He acknowledged that his behavior had been abusive and criminal, and he took full responsibility for the consequences he was facing. Most importantly, he didn't ask for anything. He didn't request forgiveness, money, or a relationship. He simply apologized and said he hoped I was happy and healthy. It was the letter I'd been waiting 35 years to receive, and it arrived 20 years too late. I wrote back once, a short note acknowledging his apology and wishing him well in his efforts to become a better person. But I didn't offer reconciliation or suggest that we might rebuild our relationship in the future. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. 2 years later, I received another envelope with no return address. This time, it contained 2 photographs and a brief note from Stephanie. The photos showed a beautiful toddler with curly dark hair and bright eyes, playing in what looked like a suburban backyard. Emma had grown into a happy, healthy child who looked nothing like Marcus and everything like the best parts of my family genetics. Stephanie's note was brief, but meaningful. Mrs. Walsh, I wanted you to know that Marcus and I separated last year. He's been in counseling and seems to be trying to change, but I couldn't trust him around Emma after everything that happened. I'm raising her on my own now, and she's an amazing little girl. If you ever want to meet her, you're welcome to contact me. I understand if you don't, but I wanted you to know the door is open. I looked at the photographs for a long time, seeing Robert's eyes and my mother's smile in that little face. Emma was an innocent child who deserved to know her grandmother, but she also deserved to be protected from the toxic dynamics that had defined my relationship with her father. I decided to wait. Maybe when Emma was older, when she could understand complex family situations and make her own choices about relationships, I would reach out to Stephanie. But for now, it was enough to know that she was safe and loved. On my 75th birthday, I threw myself a party. Not a surprise party organized by well-meaning friends, but a celebration I planned and hosted myself, inviting the people who'd become important to me in my new life. Eleanor drove down from our old neighborhood, along with several other longtime friends. My book club came, as did volunteers from the animal shelter and neighbors from my condominium complex. Frank brought flowers and made a toast that brought tears to my eyes. As I looked around my living room filled with people who genuinely cared about me, I realized that this was what family was supposed to feel like. Not obligation or manipulation or conditional love based on what you could provide for someone else. Just mutual respect, affection, and support freely given and received. I'd spent 60 years trying to create this feeling with Marcus, sacrificing my own needs and enabling his worst impulses in the hopes that love alone could transform him into the person I wanted him to be. But real love doesn't require sacrifice from only one person, and healthy relationships don't survive on manipulation and guilt. At 75, I was finally learning what it meant to be loved for who I was, rather than what I could give. It had taken losing my son to find my family, but I couldn't bring myself to regret the trade. That night, after the guests had gone home and the dishes were washed, I sat on my balcony watching the sunset and thinking about the future. I had plans to travel, places I wanted to see, and things I wanted to experience. I had friendships to nurture and volunteer work that gave my life meaning. Most importantly, I had peace. The constant anxiety that had defined my relationship with Marcus was gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived on my own terms. I thought about the woman I'd been 5 years earlier, desperate to please a son who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome. That woman would have been horrified by the choices I'd made, the relationships I'd ended, and the independence I'd claimed. But that woman had been living someone else's life, making decisions based on other people's expectations and needs. This woman, the one sitting on the balcony watching the sun set over her chosen home, was finally living for herself. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Frank's name appeared on the caller ID, and I smiled as I answered. Catherine, I just wanted to thank you again for today. Your party was wonderful. Thank you for being there. It meant a lot to me. You know, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about starting new chapters even when you think your story is almost over. What about it? Well, I was wondering if you'd like to start a new chapter together. Nothing dramatic, just two people who've figured out what really matters in life. I looked out at the sunset, thinking about second chances and the courage it takes to remain open to love even after betrayal. Frank, I'd like that very much. As I hung up the phone, I realized that this was the ending I'd never dared to imagine. Not the fairy tale reconciliation with Marcus that I'd fantasized about for years, but something better. A life built on truth instead of illusion, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. Marcus had taught me an unexpected lesson through his cruelty. He'd shown me that loving someone doesn't mean letting them destroy you, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is walking away from someone who can't or won't treat you with respect. I'd lost a son, but I'd found myself. And at 75 years old, I was finally ready to see what adventures lay ahead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.